You have no business being in this neighborhood. Hands on the hood now." The young cop's voice cracked with unearned authority, his hand resting aggressively on his holster. He thought he was putting a thug in his place. He thought he held all the power on this quiet, affluent street. What Officer Marcus Ellison didn't know as he shoved the older black man against the polished Bentley was that he hadn't just profiled a criminal. He had just assaulted Victor Langford, the new deputy police commissioner. And karma wasn't just coming. It was already here. The sun was beginning its slow descent over Oak Creek Estates, casting long golden shadows across manicured lawns that looked more like velvet than grass. This was a neighborhood where wealth wasn't just spoken, clear as throat. It was whispered through the precise trimming of hedges, the quiet purr of luxury electric vehicles, and the heavy ornate iron gates that guarded the driveways. It was a place where trouble rarely ventured, and when it did, it was usually in the form of a minor HOA dispute. For Officer Marcus Ellison, Oak Creek was his favorite patrol route. It was easy, safe, and it made him feel important. Ellison, a 5-year veteran of the force, had a chip on his shoulder the size of a service weapon. He was known among his peers as a hard charger, a euphemism for a cop who was too eager, too aggressive, and too quick to judge. He craved respect, but often mistook fear for authority. His uniform was always perfectly pressed, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his demeanor perpetually tense, as if he were policing a war zone rather than a gated community. Cruising down Elmwood Drive in his patrol cruiser, Ellison's eyes scanned the serene street. His radio was quiet, the air conditioning blowing a steady stream of cold air against the stifling late summer heat. That's when he saw him. A black man, perhaps in his late 50s, dressed in a sharp, casual linen suit, was walking slowly down the sidewalk. The man carried himself with an effortless grace, his posture straight, his head held high. He paused to admire a particularly vibrant bed of hydrangeas outside the sprawling Vance residence. Ellison's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Clear's throat, his mind conditioned by years of unchecked biases and a toxic precinct culture, immediately began to race, constructing a narrative that fit his worldview. What is he doing here? He doesn't fit the profile, probably casing the joint. The man was Victor Langford. If Ellison had spent more time reading internal department memos and less time bragging in the locker room, he might have recognized the face. Langford was a legend. He had spent 30 years climbing the ranks of the state police, starting as a beat cop in the toughest wards of Chicago before moving into administration and policy reform. He was brilliant, uncompromising, and deeply respected by those who mattered. Just 3 days prior, the mayor had announced Langford's appointment as the new deputy police commissioner, a move designed to clean up a department plagued by excessive force complaints. Complaints often generated by officers exactly like Marcus Ellison. Victor was simply taking a walk to clear his head. He had just closed on a house 3 blocks over, a beautiful mid-century modern home, whom he planned to share with his wife Sarah. He was enjoying the peace, unaware of the predator in a blue uniform stalking him from the street. Ellison slowed the cruiser to a crawl, trailing Victor by 20 yards. He watched as Victor reached into his linen jacket. Ellison's pulse spiked. A weapon? Tools. Victor pulled out a sleek smartphone, dialed a number, and held it to his ear, smiling warmly as the call connected. "Sarah, honey, you're going to love the garden space on the south side of the lot." To Ellison, this was all the confirmation he needed. He was a suspect making a lookout call. Ellison flipped on his light bar. No siren, just the aggressive silent flash of red and blue reflecting off the manicured trees. He accelerated, throwing the cruiser into park at a harsh angle that blocked the sidewalk, effectively trapping Victor between the car and a high stone wall. Victor stopped, his conversation with his wife pausing. He looked at the flashing lights, confusion briefly passing over his face before settling into a mask of calm, weary resignation. He knew this dance. He had seen it from both sides of the badge for decades. But today, he wasn't wearing a uniform. He was just a black man in a wealthy white neighborhood. Ellison threw open his door, his hand already resting heavily on the butt of his sidearm. He didn't unholster it, but the implication was clear. He puffed out his chest, trying to look larger, more imposing than his average frame allowed. "Hold it right there," Ellison barked, his voice sharp and loud, shattering the quiet evening. "Hang up the phone now." Victor slowly lowered the phone, his eyes locking onto Ellison's name tag. Ellison, he filed the name away. Is there a problem, officer? Victor asked, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that carried natural authority. An authority Ellison immediately bristled against. I asked the questions, Ellison snapped, stepping closer, invading Victor's personal space. What are you doing in this neighborhood? The air between them seemed to crackle with tension. Victor remained perfectly still, his posture relaxed but attentive. He had trained rookies on how to handle these exact situations, on how to de-escalate. Ellison was doing the exact opposite. He was a textbook example of aggressive escalation. I am taking a walk, officer, Victor replied evenly, slipping his phone into his pocket slowly so as not to spook the clearly agitated young cop. I believe the sidewalks are public property. Don't get smart with me. Ellison growled, stepping within inches of Victor. He could smell the expensive cologne Victor wore, which only seemed to anger him further. Probably stolen, Ellison thought, his prejudice blinding him to logic. We've had a string of burglaries in this area. You fit the description of a suspicious person reported by a neighbor. It was a lie, and Victor knew it. There had been no report. The radio had been silent. This was a classic pretext stop driven by bias. A suspicious person? Victor asked, raising an eyebrow. And what exactly is suspicious about me? My linen suit or my skin color? The directness of the question threw Ellison off balance for a split second, but his ego quickly recovered, mutating into rage. How dare this man challenge him? He was the law here. I said, don't get smart, Ellison shouted, his voice echoing off the stone wall. He pointed a rigid finger at Victor's chest. You have no business being in this neighborhood. Turn around and put your hands on the hood of my car now. Victor didn't move. He looked deeply into Ellison's eyes, searching for a glimmer of reason, of actual police work. He found only arrogance and fear. Officer Ellison, Victor said, his tone shifting from polite citizen to something harder, something commanding. I strongly suggest you take a step back and reconsider your actions. You are operating without reasonable suspicion or probable cause. You are violating my civil rights. Ellison laughed. A harsh, ugly sound. Listen to the street lawyer. You think you know the law better than me, criminal? Turn around. When Victor still didn't comply, Ellison made his move. He lunged forward, grabbing Victor roughly by the shoulder of his expensive suit, attempting to spin him around toward the cruiser. Victor, despite being 20 years older, was in excellent shape and had decades of defensive tactics training. He didn't fight back, but he planted his feet firmly, making himself an immovable object. Ellison strained, his face turning red, but he couldn't budge the older man. Embarrassed and enraged by his physical failure, Ellison abandoned protocol entirely. He unclipped his handcuffs and swung his weight into Victor, violently shoving him against the side of the police cruiser. The impact was loud, Victor's ribs taking the brunt of the force against the metal door. Stop resisting, Ellison yelled, a phrase he was taught to shout to justify force, regardless of whether the suspect was actually resisting. I am not resisting, Victor said calmly, though the breath had been knocked out of him. Clear his throat. He kept his hands visible, pressing them flat against the roof of the car. But I will assure you, Officer Ellison, you are making a monumental mistake. The only mistake is you thinking you can come into my town and steal. Ellison spat, forcefully grabbing Victor's left wrist and wrenching it behind his back, slapping a steel cuff onto it, so tight it bit into the flesh. He grabbed the other arm, completing the binding. Victor was now handcuffed, leaning against the cruiser in his own neighborhood. A neighbor, an older woman walking a golden retriever, stopped at the end of the block, watching the scene with wide, fearful eyes. Ellison puffed his chest out again, putting on a show for his audience, securing the area from the dangerous man in the tailored suit. You have the right to remain silent. Ellison began reciting the Miranda warning, his voice dripping with condescension as he began to pat Victor down, roughly searching his pockets. Anything you say? He pulled out Victor's wallet from his breast pocket. It was a slim leather card holder. Can and will be used against you in a court of law, Ellison finished, flipping the wallet open with one hand. I suggest you look very closely at the identification in that wallet, officer, Victor said, his voice terrifyingly quiet now. The storm wasn't brewing anymore. It was here. Ellison scoffed. Let's see who you really are, Victor, he said, reading the name off the sleek silver embossed driver's license. But underneath the driver's license was another card, a heavy gold metal shield set into rich leather. Ellison's eyes darted from the driver's license to the badge. Deputy Commissioner of Police, Victor Langford III. The air rushed out of Ellison's lungs as if he had been punched. The confident sneer melted off his face, replaced by a sudden, sickening pall. He stared at the badge, then up at the man he had just assaulted and handcuffed. The man whose picture had been on the front page of the internal police newsletter that morning. The man who was now his boss's boss's boss. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the low hum of the cruiser's engine. Ellison stood frozen, the leather wallet trembling slightly in his hand. His mind scrambled, desperately trying to find an alternate explanation. A fake badge, a stolen identity, but the face on the license perfectly matched the man standing calmly before him. The heavy weight of the commissioner's shield was unmistakable. "Is there a problem with my identification, Officer Ellison?" Victor asked, his voice smooth, betraying none of the physical discomfort of the tight handcuffs or the impact against the car. Ellison swallowed hard. His mouth was suddenly completely dry. "Sir," he stammered, the aggressive bravado evaporating into thin air. "You called me a criminal," Victor stated, turning his head slightly to look Ellison in the eye. "You stated I fit the description of a burglary suspect. You claim to have received a call. I am waiting for you to process my arrest, officer." Ellison fumbled with the wallet, nearly dropping it on the pavement. He rushed to unholster his handcuff key. His hands were shaking so violently he struggled to fit the small key into the keyhole. "Sir Commissioner Langford, there's been a terrible misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Victor asked as the cuffs finally clicked open. He rubbed his wrists slowly, feeling the deep red indentations left by the cold steel. He didn't turn around immediately, letting the weight of his presence crush the young officer. "Which part was misunderstood, Ellison? The part where you profiled me based on my race? The part where you lied about a dispatch call to justify an illegal stop? Or the part where you assaulted me when I calmly questioned your authority?" Ellison felt as though the pavement was opening up to swallow him. He was looking at the end of his career, perhaps even jail time. "Commissioner, please. It's getting dark. You didn't look like you belonged." "Belonged?" Victor spun around finally, and the look in his eyes made Ellison take a physical step backward. There was no rage there, only a cold, calculated judgment that was infinitely more terrifying. "Because I am black, because I am wearing a suit on a Tuesday evening. That is your metric for who belongs in Oak Creek Estates." "No, sir, that's not what I meant," Ellison pleaded, his voice cracking. The neighbor with the golden retriever was still watching, now confused as to why the suspect was suddenly lecturing the police officer. "I bought the property at 442 Willow Creek Drive 3 days ago." "Ellison," Victor said, gesturing vaguely down the street. "I am your resident. I am your employer. And currently, I am your victim." Victor reached out and calmly plucked his wallet from Ellison's trembling hand. He slipped it back into his pocket, adjusting his jacket. "Let me explain to you what is going to happen now, officer." Ellison stood at attention, a reflex drilled into him at the academy, though his knees felt like jelly. "Yes, sir. You are going to get in your vehicle," Victor instructed, his tone clipped and professional. "You are going to return to the precinct. You will immediately turn in your badge and your service weapon to the desk, Sergeant. You will inform him that you have been suspended without pay, effective immediately, pending an internal affairs investigation initiated by the Deputy Commissioner." "Commissioner Langford, please," Ellison begged, tears pricking the corners of his eyes. "I have a family. I made a mistake. I was just trying to be proactive." "Proactive policing does not require shredding the Constitution, Ellison," Victor replied sharply. "You didn't make a mistake. A mistake is writing the wrong date on a citation. What you did was execute a targeted, biased attack fueled by an inflated ego and a badge you are unworthy to wear. You are exactly the type of cancer I was hired to excise from this department." Victor took a step closer, lowering his voice so only Ellison could hear. "You thought you had all the power because you carried a gun and wore blue. You forgot that true power is the law, and you broke it. Your shift is over, Ellison, forever." Victor didn't wait for a response. He turned on his heel and continued his walk down the sidewalk, his stride as measured and calm as it had been before the interruption. He didn't look back. Ellison stood alone by his cruiser, the flashing lights now feeling like a harsh, mocking strobe. He looked at his shaking hands, realizing that in less than 10 minutes his entire life had unraveled. He had tried to put a criminal in his place, only to realize he was the one wearing the handcuffs of his own ignorance. The 42nd precinct was a hive of activity, a typical Tuesday night filled with petty theft processing, noise complaint dispatches, and the low hum of stressed officers. Desk Sergeant Miller, a 20-year veteran with a graying mustache and a seen-it-all demeanor, was sipping cold coffee when the door slid open. Officer Marcus Ellison walked in. Miller frowned. Ellison wasn't due back for end of shift for another 3 hours. But it wasn't just his early arrival. It was how he looked. Ellison, normally strutting with an inflated sense of self-importance, looked like a ghost. His uniform seemed too big for him. His clear throat, shoulders were slumped, and his face was drained of all color. "Ellison, what's going on?" Miller asked, standing up behind the elevated desk. "Car trouble." Ellison didn't speak immediately. He walked slowly to the desk, his movements wooden. He unclipped his utility belt, the heavy leather making a loud thud as he placed it on the counter. Next came his radio, and finally his service weapon carefully unloaded, placed next to the belt. The bullpen went quiet. Several officers stopped typing their reports, turning to watch. An officer surrendering his weapon midship was never good news. It meant a critical incident, a shooting, a severe crash, or a catastrophic failure. "Marcus," Miller said, his voice dropping an octave, taking on a serious paternal tone. "Talk to me. What happened out there?" Ellison reached up with trembling fingers and unpinned the silver badge from his chest. He laid it gently next to the gun. "I need to turn these in, SG." "Why?" Miller demanded. "Did you discharge your weapon?" "No," Ellison whispered, staring blindly at his badge. "I'm suspended, pending internal affairs investigation." Murmurs rippled through the bullpen. "Suspended? By who?" Miller asked, bewildered. "The captain isn't even in the building." Ellison finally looked up, his eyes hollow. "By the deputy commissioner, Victor Langford." The name hit the room like a shockwave. Langford's reputation preceded him, and his recent appointment was the talk of the department. He was known as a reformer, a man who didn't tolerate corruption or abuse of power. "Langford," Miller echoed, confused. "How? Where did you even see him?" "Oak Creek Estates," Ellison said, the shame causing his voice to break. "I stopped him. I thought he was a burglar." He couldn't bring himself to say the rest out loud in front of the entire squad. "I put him in cuffs." A collective gasp echoed in the room. An older detective in the back let out a low whistle. "You cuffed the new deputy commissioner," the detective muttered. "Son, you didn't just step in it. You dove in head first." Miller pinched the bridge of his nose, closing his eyes. "Tell me you had probable cause, Marcus. Tell me he was matching a description." "I thought he was acting suspicious," Ellison stammered, clinging to the lie that had started it all. "He was on his phone looking at houses." "A black man in a nice suit looking at houses," Miller translated, his voice hardening with disappointment. "Did you run his ID before or after you put hands on him?" Ellison didn't answer. His silence was a confession. Miller sighed, a heavy, tired sound. He picked up the phone. "I need to call the captain at home." "Go wait in the break room, Ellison. Don't talk to anyone. Don't make any calls." As Ellison took the walk of shame toward the break room, the whispers grew louder. He had been a bully, and many in the precinct had known it, though few had spoken up. The thin blue line was strong, but it had its limits, and arresting the second highest-ranking officer in the city based on blatant racial profiling was well beyond those limits. Meanwhile, Victor Langford arrived at his current apartment across town. He poured himself a glass of bourbon, neat, and sat in his armchair overlooking the city skyline. His ribs ached where Ellison had shoved him, a physical reminder of the rot he was hired to cut out. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. It was answered on the first ring. "Mayor's office chief of staff speaking." "David, it's Victor," Langford said, taking a sip of the burning liquid. "We need to accelerate the timeline on the internal affairs overhaul, and I need a press conference scheduled for tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. I have a case study we're going to present to the public regarding proactive policing and departmental accountability." "Is everything all right, Victor?" David asked, sensing the steel in Langford's voice. "Everything is perfectly fine," Victor replied, looking out over the city he was sworn to protect. "We're just going to do some spring cleaning a little early this year, starting with the 42nd precinct." The next morning, the press room at police headquarters was packed. Journalists, community leaders, and senior police brass crammed into the space, murmuring anxiously. Rumors had been swirling since late last night about an incident involving the new deputy commissioner. At exactly 10 a.m., Victor Langford walked to the podium. He wasn't wearing his uniform. He wore a sharp, dark navy suit, looking every bit the statesman and leader he was. He commanded the room without saying a word. The flashes of cameras illuminated the room as he adjusted the microphone. "Good morning," Victor began, his voice projecting clearly. "I was appointed to this position to bring transparency, accountability, and reform to a department that has in some areas lost the trust of the community it serves. I promised the mayor and I promised you, the citizens, that I would lead by example." He paused, sweeping his gaze across the room. "Yesterday evening, I experienced firsthand the exact type of policing we are working to eradicate." The room went dead silent. Pens hovered over notepads. Victor detailed the encounter in Oak Creek Estates. He was clinical and precise in his recounting. He described the lack of probable cause, the immediate escalation, the physical assault, and the deployment of handcuffs, all before his identity was even questioned. He did not embellish. The facts were damning enough on their own. The officer involved, Marcus Ellison, operated on bias, not on training. He operated on ego, not on law, Victor stated firmly. He assumed that because of the color of my skin, I was inherently suspicious in an affluent neighborhood. He assumed that his badge gave him the right to bypass my civil liberties. He leaned forward, placing his hands on the edges of the podium. "If this is how an officer treats a man in a tailored suit in broad daylight, how is he treating the young men in our marginalized communities in the dead of night?" The question hung heavy in the air. "Effective immediately," Victor announced, the finality in his voice ringing like a bell. "Officer Marcus Ellison's employment with this department is terminated." A flurry of whispers broke out among the press. Immediate termination was rare. Usually, officers were allowed to resign or were placed on long-term administrative leave. Furthermore, Victor continued, raising a hand to quell the noise. "The body cam footage from Officer Ellison's cruiser, which confirms every detail of my account, is being released to the public today. We are turning this matter over to the district attorney's office to explore criminal charges for assault under color of authority and civil rights violations." The fallout was immediate and devastating for Ellison. He watched the press conference from his living room sofa, his wife crying softly in the kitchen. He was ruined. The police union, usually staunch defenders of their own, issued a brief statement distancing themselves, claiming they could not defend blatant violations of protocol. The body cam footage went viral within hours. It was a textbook example of everything wrong with bad policing. The internet did what it does best. It condemned him globally. Ellison's face was plastered across every news network. He wasn't just a fired cop. He was the poster child for institutional racism. Within a week, the district attorney, eager to show they were tough on police misconduct, formally charged Ellison with misdemeanor assault and felony deprivation of rights under color of law. The trial was swift. Ellison's defense attorney tried to argue that Ellison was merely following the broken windows theory of policing, but the body cam footage destroyed any defense. The jury saw an arrogant young man assault a calm, complaint older citizen purely based on prejudice. When the guilty verdict was read, Ellison broke down in tears. The judge, noting the severe breach of public trust, sentenced him to 3 years in a state penitentiary, heavily segregated for his own protection as a former law enforcement officer. As he was let out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the cold steel biting into his wrists just as they had bitten into Victor Langford's, Ellison looked into the gallery. Sitting in the back row, arms crossed, was Deputy Commissioner Langford. Victor's expression was unreadable, neither gloating nor sympathetic. He was simply witnessing the consequences of the law he upheld. Prison for a former cop is a unique kind of hell. Ellison spent 23 hours a day in a small concrete cell in the protective custody wing. He was isolated, paranoid, and drowning in regret. He lost his home. His wife, unable to bear the public scrutiny and the financial ruin, filed for divorce 6 months into his sentence. He had hours to sit and replay that evening on Elmwood Drive. He realized how easily it could have been avoided if he had just driven past. If he had just rolled down his window and said hello. If he had treated the man like a human being instead of a target. His ego had built his cage, and his prejudice had locked the door. 3 years later, Ellison was released on parole. He was 32 years old, an ex-con, clears throat, disgraced former police officer. He possessed no marketable skills other than law enforcement, a career path that was now permanently closed to him. He moved into a small, dingy apartment in a rough part of the city. Ironically, the exact type of neighborhood he used to aggressively over-police. He found a job working the night shift as a security guard at a rundown strip mall. The pay was minimum wage, the uniform was ill-fitting polyester, and the badge was cheap plastic. Every night he walked his rounds, checking locked doors and shooing away teenagers. He was a ghost of his former self, a man broken by the weight of his own actions. One rainy Tuesday night, Ellison was standing under the awning of a closed porn shop, trying to stay dry. A sleek black town car pulled up to the curb a few feet away. The back window rolled down, and a face looked out. It was Victor Langford. He looked older now, the gray at his temples more prominent, but his eyes were just as sharp. He was now the commissioner of the entire department, having successfully implemented sweeping reforms that had dramatically reduced use of force incidents. Ellison froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He instinctively reached for a gun that wasn't there, a phantom reflex from a life long gone. He looked down at his cheap plastic badge, overwhelming shame washing over him. Langford didn't say anything at first. He just looked at Ellison, taking in the frayed uniform, the tired posture, the defeat in the younger man's eyes. "Ellison, clears throat," Langford said softly over the sound of the rain. "Commissioner," Ellison replied, his voice barely a rasp. He didn't know whether to salute, run, or beg for forgiveness. He just stood there, letting the rain blow sideways against his face. "I read your parole reports," Langford said. "I hear you've been keeping your head down, working." "Yes, sir. Just trying to survive." Langford nodded slowly. "Karma is a harsh teacher, Marcus. She doesn't grade on a curve." "I know, sir," Ellison said, looking down at his scuffed boots. "I learned my lesson. I lost everything." "You lost what you didn't deserve to hold in the first place." Langford corrected him gently, but firmly. "Power is a privilege, not a right. When you abuse it, the universe has a way of correcting the balance." Langford rolled the window up halfway, preparing to leave. He paused. "For what it's worth, Ellison, the department is better now. Your incident became the catalyst for the changes we needed. You served a purpose, just not the one you intended." With that, the window closed completely, and the town car pulled away, its red tail lights disappearing into the rainy night. Ellison stood alone in the dark, the cold rain soaking through his thin jacket. He was a man who had once thought he ruled the streets, now left to guard the discarded remnants of the city, haunted forever by the ghost of his own arrogance. The encounter under the awning was the last time Marcus Ellison ever saw Victor Langford. But the ripple effect of their collision continued to shape both the city and Ellison's own quiet, desperate life. Under Commissioner Langford's tenure, the police department underwent a radical transformation. The Ellison Protocol, as it was unofficially dubbed by the media, became a mandatory training module for all recruits and veteran officers. It focused heavily on implicit bias, de-escalation techniques, and the strict legal definitions of probable cause versus reasonable suspicion. Langford instituted civilian oversight boards with actual teeth, capable of recommending termination for officers who repeatedly violated civil rights. The culture shifted. It wasn't perfect. Systemic issues took decades to dismantle. But the era of cowboys like Marcus Ellison aggressively roaming wealthy neighborhoods looking for people who didn't belong was over. The community began slowly to trust the badge again. Langford retired after 5 years, celebrated as a visionary leader who took a broken system and forced it to look in the mirror. As for Ellison, his path was far less celebrated. His life settled into a monotonous, grinding routine. The security job at the strip mall paid just enough to keep him housed and fed, but it offered no dignity. He was frequently mocked by the same local kids he used to hassle when he wore the real blue uniform. They remembered him. The streets never forgot. He tried to apply for better jobs, managerial positions in retail, dispatch work, but the background check always flagged his felony conviction. Deprivation of rights under color of law. It was a scarlet letter that screamed untrustworthy. No corporate entity wanted the liability of hiring the racist cop who went viral. Years turned into a decade. Ellison's hair thinned and grayed rapidly. The aggressive posture that once defined him had collapsed into a permanent slouch. He spent his days off sitting in his small apartment watching television, haunted by the digital ghost of his past. He couldn't escape the internet. Every few years, the body cam footage would resurface on social media as a grim reminder, a viral meme of instant karma. He would see his own younger, arrogant face sneering at Langford, and he would feel physically ill. One winter evening, while patrolling a grocery store parking lot, Ellison saw a young, aggressive security guard, barely out of his teens, yelling at an elderly Hispanic man who was struggling to start his old pickup truck. The guard had his hand on his pepper spray, puffing out his chest, trying to look big. He was escalating a non-issue out of pure ego. Ellison felt a jolt of recognition. He was looking in a mirror from 15 years ago. He walked over quickly. "Hey, back off," Ellison said to the young guard, his voice raspy but firm. "He's just having car trouble." "Mind your business, old man," the kid snapped. "I'm securing the lot. You're harassing a guy trying to get home," Ellison countered, stepping between the kid and the truck. "I know exactly what you're doing. You think that badge makes you tough? It doesn't. It makes you a target if you misuse it. Walk away before you ruin your own life." The young guard scoffed, but something in Ellison's dead, hollow eyes made him hesitate. He backed down, muttering curses, and walked away. Ellison turned to the elderly man and helped him jumpstart the truck. As the man drove away, waving his thanks, Ellison stood in the cold parking lot. It wasn't redemption. He knew he could never undo the damage he had caused Victor Langford, or the fear he had instilled in countless others during his time on the force. But as he pulled his thin coat tighter against the wind, he realized that karma wasn't just about punishment. Sometimes it was about stripping a man down to nothing, just so he could finally learn how to see someone else. He had been a powerful man who acted like a criminal, and now he was a criminal who had finally learned how to be a man. If this story of absolute power, devastating prejudice, and brutal karma kept you hooked until the very end, hit that like button right now. It really helps the channel grow. What did you think of Officer Ellison's punishment? Was it enough, or did he get off easy? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. Don't forget to share this video with someone who loves a good justice story. And if you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our next dramatic tale. Thanks for watching, and remember, true power is how you treat others when you think no one is watching. See you in the next.